Today we are going to talk about one of the most important processes that happens on Earth, not just with plants, but is also important for all living things, and that is photosynthesis. The word part photo means light. Synthesis means to make. So this word translates into to make from light or make using light. And so we're going to talk about the different words that are associated with photosynthesis. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, we want to know, what does this chapter have to do with me? So first of all, plants are essential for animals, and animals are essential for plants. Those of you that know about basic ecology, we know that this has to strike a balance in order for them to coexist. We either directly or indirectly get our food from plants. So if we eat a strawberry, if we eat an apple, that is the plant itself. But also, if we eat hamburger, that comes from a beef cow. Where did the beef cow get its energy? Well, from eating corn, straw, grasses. And so the plants are the essential and the foundation of all food chains and food webs. Plants are unique in that they actually have the ability to take in energy from the sun. We as humans, we might feel better when the sun is shining, but we don't get our energy from the sun like what plants are able to do and use in that process of photosynthesis. And those of you that have a garden or are farmers and you want to keep a plant alive, this chapter will help with the basics of doing that, which is good. So first of all, energy and living things, some vocab. Autotrophs, or the 7th grade term is probably producers, are organisms that make their own food. Examples would be all plants, trees, shrubs, grasses, flowers. There are also some photosynthetic bacteria, and there's also some photosynthetic protists. You might have heard them as algae, and that's kind of the green stuff that you see maybe on top of swamps or lakes, or maybe some streams might have them also. Heterotrophs are organisms that get their energy from taking something in, their food, and they're also known as consumers. So oftentimes when we think of consumers, we think of lions, tigers, bears, oh my, and indeed they are. But it also would be something as simple as like a butterfly, a moth, an ant, where they're taking something in order to get their food. So don't always think of the big stuff as just the consumers. So sometimes we will also put a prefix in front of these words. So for example, chem or chemo means chemical. Photo, as we discussed, means light. So if I asked you, okay, what does a chemoautotroph mean? That means that they make their own food, that's autotroph, from chemicals. We see these with some creatures that live in like deep sea vents in the ocean. If I asked you what a photoautotroph would mean, well, those are our plants. They make their own food, that's the autotroph, from light. And finally, a chemoheterotroph. That means that they take chemicals in order to get their energy. Now, the only one that's not on there, combination that's not on there, is a photoheterotroph. That's something that would eat light in order to get its energy, and we don't have any of those. We don't see people chomping at light or chomping at sunlight. That would just be weird. All right, so all energy, all creatures, their goal is to get it into a certain cellular energy called ATP, which stands for Adenosine Triphosphate. And ATP is made out of a sugar, a base, and a phosphate group. It gets triphosphate because if you count the yellow P's there, 1, 2, 3, that's how many it has when there is energy. And so we say that ATP is the energy currency of all living things. So if I'm a bacteria, if I'm a fungi, if I'm a plant, if I'm an animal, ATP is what's used on a cellular level. It also has enough energy to drive most of the cell's activities. So if a cell moves, if it takes something in, if it's maintaining homeostasis, ATP is able to do that, and that's the energy source that's available. Now, ATP can also lose a phosphate and become a DP. So up here, adenosine triphosphate, tricycle, 1, 2, 3, loses a P and it becomes ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, which would be 2. So ATP has energy. If it was to happen to lose its phosphate group, that means that it no longer has energy. At least that would be used on a cellular level. What's nice is that this whole adding and subtracting of P is super easy and is super important with the process of cell metabolism. All right, so how do plants use light? We're talking photosynthesis now. So plants are green, right? So they use green light. No, they don't. The color that we see is actually being reflected back to our eyes. So you maybe heard of, like, if you have a white shirt on, you would stay cooler than if you had a black shirt on. Why? White reflects all colors of light. Black absorbs it. So that's why, because it's absorbing more of the light energy, it's going to have more energy and thus heat up. So plants, although they're green, they actually don't use the green light. So if I put a plant under a green light, it wouldn't work as well as if I put it under a red light, a purple light, a blue light. So plants have a main pigment called chlorophyll, and there's actually a couple different kinds of chlorophyll. But because chlorophyll is green, we notice that it doesn't absorb the green light, or at least not much of it. But it does absorb other colors. So if we just look at chlorophyll A, it is able to absorb violet, indigo, and some blue. It doesn't absorb green because that's what color it is, and then it does absorb a little bit of yellow, orange, and red. Carotenoid, carrot, orange, does not absorb any of the red, orange, or yellow, but it can absorb a little bit of green, blue, or purple. So sometimes this is confusing, but the color that we see is being reflected and not used. So again, essentially plants don't use the green wavelength of light, but they use other wavelengths of light. Light carries with it energy, and that energy is what drives the process of photosynthesis. And there are many different kinds of pigments that plants can use, as we see, especially in the fall. So this is very important for us. The equation for photosynthesis. So what are the bare bones essentials that plants need in order to survive? Well, they breathe in carbon dioxide. They need water. And they need light, as we just talked about. And essentially all photosynthesis is doing is it's using that light energy to re-scramble the bonds and create something new. And that new thing is a sugar molecule, and the type of sugar that plants create is called glucose. So very basic chemistry for us here. If we look at the different elements that are on this side, it is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Same over here. Well, if I count how many of each of these I have, it's going to balance out. So over here, there are 6 carbons. Over here, there are 6 carbons. Let's see how many H's there are. There are 12 over here. 6 times 2 is 12. There are 12 over here. And then my oxygens, I have 18 over here, and I have 18 over there. So how does this work? What's cool is that all photosynthesis is doing is it's re-scrambling these bonds. So you'll hear me say this a lot. The same C's that are on carbon dioxide that are breathed in are the same C's that become on the sugar. The same O's that might be found in carbon dioxide or water might become the O's on the sugar or on the oxygen that's breathed out. So that's all photosynthesis is doing. But what plants have been able to do is use that sun energy to re-scramble the bonds and actually create something that's useful for everything, that being glucose or sugar. Photosynthesis is broken down into 2 parts, the light-dependent reaction and the light-independent reaction. So light-dependent means that light is needed. Water is actually going to split into its different parts. So H2O split into the H's and the O's, and that's going to help generate energy that's useful for part 2. And that's the light independent. So the light dependent is kind of the energy supplier for part 2, which is the light independent. And that is where light is not needed. And that's actually where we're going to take the carbon dioxide and actually make the glucose from it. So here's kind of our electron transport chain and what is all happening during these steps. And so basically what is happening is that water is splitting during part 1. It's splitting into H pluses and oxygen. It is going to be stimulated by light. One of the electrons that is given off from water is going to bounce around kind of like a little bunny rabbit. Electron, if you see, has a negative charge. That negative charge actually draws in more H pluses. So these H pluses are going to be a big deal at the very end. So far we've given off some H pluses from water, and there's more H pluses coming in because of the negative pull of that electron. Then the electron kind of runs out of energy, but then another wavelength of light re-excites the electron, and it creates an energy carrier called NADPH. So we said that part 1 kind of sets the energy for part 2. That's what's happening here. So as this top part is all happening, these H pluses have accumulated inside of what's called this thylakoid, this green disc-shaped object inside of the chloroplast. So now what happens is you got a bunch of stuff here, you have not much out here. Remember, things by nature naturally want to go from areas of high to areas of low. So very similar to like putting a quarter in a carousel and making it spin, that's what these H pluses do. That H plus will go through, it will spin this purple glob, this is a protein, as are all of these globs up here, and it will combine ADP, adenosine diphosphate, that's 2, with another phosphate to become ATP, which again has energy. So what we have done in just this step is we've split water, we've breathed out oxygen, and we've created energy molecules, ATP and NADPH, that are used in part number 2. So very important is part 1, and sunlight is required to make it all happen. So what happens with part 2? Essentially, bare bones, what we're doing with this one is we're now taking carbon dioxide, we're using that energy with part number 1 to join it with other carbon dioxides to create glucose. Remember that glucose is C6H12O6. So it takes 6 turns of what we call the Kelvin-Benson cycle. This is also known as the light independent reaction to make glucose. And that is where the magic happens. That's actually how we get sugars. So this is kind of an overall picture of what happens with like a standard plant. So we know that roots take up water as well as nutrients, but water specifically for photosynthesis. Photosynthesis happens in the leaves of the plants. So plants' leaves are actually able to breathe, and they're also like solar panels. So they will take water in, the roots will, but the roots will send it then to the leaves. The leaves are able to breathe in CO2 and light energy. So there you go. You have the 3 what we call reactants. You have water, carbon dioxide, and light. And then when the magic happens, photosynthesis, the plant is going to release oxygen gas, and then sugars are created. So why do leaves get bigger? Why do plants grow? It's because the sugars that they're creating are giving them energy to grow. And that photosynthesis, the more photosynthesis that's happening, the more growth a plant will have. So a very unique step and very, very important process is photosynthesis.